Dr. Graves wasn't just a professor, he was a force of nature. His philosophy lectures at Stanford weren't lessons, they were intellectual battlegrounds. With a razor-sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, he dismantled belief systems like a master watchmaker stripping down an old timepiece. His reputation stretched far beyond campus. Clips of his debates had gone viral, where he was either hailed as a fearless warrior of reason or condemned as an arrogant cynic who took pleasure in shattering faith. His students knew the drill. The first day of class was a spectacle. He'd scan the room, eyes locking onto anyone wearing a cross, a hijab, a yarmulke. Then, with a smirk, the interrogation began. "So, tell me, do you believe because you've examined every possibility? Or because someone told you to? If God exists, why hasn't he struck me down for mocking him right now? Ever wonder if faith is just a mental crutch for those who can't handle reality?" It wasn't just the questions, it was how he asked them. His tone dared students to fight back, knowing full well most would crumble under the weight of his scrutiny. Some tried. Some held their ground. Most floundered. And he thrived on it. Faculty members spoke of him with reluctant admiration. Brilliant. Absolutely. But debating him was like stepping into a minefield. He had an uncanny ability to twist logic until his opponent walked straight into a trap. Yet, for all his confidence, there was one mystery no one could solve. Why did Dr. Graves despise faith so much? Some whispered that he had been raised in a strict religious household and rebelled. Others speculated that a personal tragedy had turned him against God. But one thing was clear. He saw faith as dangerous, irrational, and an illusion that needed to be exposed. And so, year after year, he played the same game, challenging, humiliating, breaking down religious students until they either abandoned their beliefs or learned to stay silent. Then one semester, Barron Trump walked into his class. The lecture hall was packed, as always, some students eager for the syllabus, others just there for the show. Dr. Graves leaned casually against his desk, sleeves rolled up, smirk in place. The whiteboard read, "Faith in Modern Society, Rational Foundation or Outdated Myth." This was his arena. His home turf. Barron Trump took his seat near the center, not one to fade into the background. At 6'7", he commanded attention. But it wasn't just his height, it was his presence. While others slouched or tapped on their laptops, Barron sat upright, composed, watching. Something was different this time. Dr. Graves had no idea, but today, the game had changed. Barron Trump sat upright, his expression unreadable. For weeks, he had caught Dr. Graves' attention, not because of his last name, which carried little weight in a room where intellect ruled, but because he was quiet. Too quiet. Most students, when challenged, either shrank or scrambled for an argument. Barron did neither. He listened, processed, and responded only when necessary. He never raised his voice. Never got flustered. In a sea of students desperate to impress, he was an anomaly. And then there was the cross. A simple silver chain. Nothing flashy, but noticeable enough. He wore it every day, a silent defiance in a classroom where faith was often dismantled like an outdated machine. Dr. Graves had been waiting for the right moment. Today, he found it. His sharp gaze swept the room before landing on Barron's chest. No necklace. His smirk widened. No cross today, he mused, voice just loud enough to ensure every student heard. I guess the faith was just a prop. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, the kind that came from knowing what was about to happen. Barron didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat or scramble for an excuse. He simply met Dr. Graves' gaze, steady and unmoved. A pause. Then, in a calm, measured tone, he said, "If my faith was just a prop, you wouldn't feel the need to comment on its absence." The air in the room changed. Dr. Graves' smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Most students missed it. Barron saw it. Silence settled, thick and expectant. Even those who had been half listening were now locked in. This was supposed to be another moment where Dr. Graves effortlessly dismantled a student's belief. But something was different. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control of the discussion. The weight of Barron's words hung in the air like a slow-building storm. Students who had chuckled before now sat in silence, their gazes flicking between Barron and Dr. Graves, waiting for the professor's counter. Dr. Graves, ever the master of debate, leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. His smirk crept back, but it was thinner now, forced. He wasn't about to let a 19-year-old shake him. Clever, he admitted with a nod. But let's not pretend faith isn't largely performative. Most people wear symbols like armor because deep down, they need validation. Strip away the rituals, the prayers, the symbols, what's left? Barron tilted his head, considering the question. Then, simply, conviction. Dr. Graves let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. And what does conviction mean without evidence? You can be convicted about anything. Flat earth, ghosts, fairies in your backyard. That doesn't make it true. Barron remained unfazed. What about love? Dr. Graves arched an eyebrow. What about it? You can't measure it. You can't put it in a test tube. But people live and die for it every day. Does that make love an illusion? A murmur rippled through the class. Dr. Graves opened his mouth, then hesitated. It lasted barely a second. But it said everything. Barron didn't wait for a response. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. You always ask why people believe in God. Let me ask you something. Why do you care so much? Why does someone else's faith bother you? That hit a nerve. For the first time, Dr. Graves' confidence wavered. Not enough for most students to notice, but enough for Barron to see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Irritation? Discomfort? Maybe even something deeper. I don't care, Graves finally said. But there was a slight edge to his voice. I challenge belief because it needs to be challenged. People should think critically, not follow blindly. And you assume faith is blind? Barron asked. Dr. Graves pushed off his desk and paced toward the center of the room, regaining his footing. Of course it is, he said. You can't see God. You can't prove his existence. Faith asks you to accept something without evidence. That's the very definition of blind belief. Barron shook his head. No. Faith is believing in something even when you don't have all the answers. There's a difference. Dr. Graves scoffed. That's just a poetic way of justifying superstition. Barron didn't blink. Or maybe it's a sign that some things exist beyond what we can fully comprehend. Silence deepened. The students weren't just listening anymore. They were watching something shift. For years, Dr. Graves had prided himself on tearing apart arguments like these, reducing them to dust. But today, the dust wasn't settling debated theologians, scholars, even pastors. Every time, logic had won. But this was different. Barron wasn't scrambling. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't even trying to win. And that made him impossible to dismantle. Dr. Graves turned back toward the class, scanning their faces. He needed to regain control. Let's put it this way, he began, pacing again. If faith is about believing without seeing, then what stops anyone from believing in anything? You say faith isn't blind, but without evidence, how do you separate truth from myth? Barron remained calm. You act like evidence is just numbers and formulas, he said. But people rely on things they can't see all the time. Justice, morality, human rights. Those aren't tangible, but we base entire societies on them. Does that make them myths? Dr. Graves smirked. Those things are built on reason, on an agreed social contract. They exist because we create them. Barron leaned forward slightly. Or maybe they exist because they're real, whether we acknowledge them or not. Religion, on the other hand, asks us to believe in an invisible being governing the universe. That's the difference. Barron nodded slowly. So if something exists beyond human creation but we can't fully understand it, you dismiss it? I dismiss what can't be proven, Dr. Graves said flatly. Barron leaned forward slightly. Then prove to me that love exists. Dr. Graves scoffed. That's not the same thing. It is, Barron interrupted, his voice steady. You say love is real, but where's the proof? You can see people express love, but you can't put love itself under a microscope. You say morality is real, but show me the raw data that proves it. Just because something isn't physical doesn't mean it isn't real. A few students exchanged glances. It was a simple argument, but it was landing. Dr. Graves' jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't losing. He refused to believe that. But he wasn't winning either. Fine, he said, shifting tactics. Let's say I concede that some things exist beyond what we can measure. That still doesn't prove God. It doesn't prove faith isn't just a comforting illusion. And what if it's not? Barron asked. Dr. Graves blinked. What? You always argue against faith as if the burden of proof is on believers, Barron said. But what if faith is real? What if there is something greater than what we can comprehend? You assume it's an illusion, but have you ever actually considered that maybe, just maybe, you're wrong? The room felt smaller, tighter. For the first time, Dr. Graves didn't have an immediate response. And the students felt it. The balance of power had shifted. And this time, it wasn't in the professor's favor. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, frustration, amusement, maybe even discomfort. Whatever it was, he masked it quickly, straightening his posture, arms crossed. You think you've turned the argument on me, he said, voice measured. But that's just rhetoric. The burden of proof is on believers. If I claim there's an invisible dragon in my garage, I can't expect you to prove it doesn't exist. That's not how logic works. Barron didn't flinch. He let the words settle before replying, his tone calm. But you're not arguing logic, Dr. Graves. You're arguing certainty. A flicker of confusion crossed the professor's face. What? You speak as if there's no chance you could be wrong, Barron said. That's not logic. That's faith. A shift ran through the room. Students sat up straighter, their gazes bouncing between the two. Barron clasped his hands together, his expression unreadable. You say faith is blind belief. But isn't it just as blind to assume nothing exists beyond what we can measure? You put your faith in human reasoning. I put mine in something greater. Dr. Graves scoffed. So you admit it's just faith. Nothing more. Barron's expression didn't change. I admit that every person on this earth, atheist, believer, scientist, philosopher, we all put our faith in something. The difference is, I acknowledge mine. You pretend you don't have any. The air in the lecture hall grew heavy, thick with something more than words. Dr. Graves was a master at dismantling belief. But now, for the first time, he was the one being examined. A student near the back hesitantly raised a hand, a girl with dark-rimmed glasses, a philosophy major, known for being just as skeptical as Dr. Graves himself. Professor, she said carefully, do you ever wonder if you could be wrong? All eyes turned to him. His jaw tensed. It was a simple question, but the wrong answer could make him look like exactly what he claimed to despise. A man so sure of his own beliefs that he couldn't accept another possibility. Dr. Graves let out a slow breath, running a hand over his chin. I don't deal in absolutes, he finally said. I question everything. Barron nodded. Then question this. Why does faith bother you so much? Silence. 4 years, the students had watched Dr. Graves dismantle arguments with ease. But today, something was different. Something had changed. And for the first time in his career, Dr. Graves had no answer. Graves wasn't the one with the last word. But if there was one thing he hated more than faith, it was losing. 4 years, he dictated the flow of discussions, guiding students into intellectual corners where they had no choice but to concede. But now, it was different. The room wasn't waiting for him to dismantle an argument. They were waiting for something else. An answer. He could feel the weight of their stares, the girl in the back, the students shifting in their seats, and Barron, silent, steady, waiting. Graves inhaled deeply, letting the silence stretch. He had debated religious scholars before. He had taken on entire panels of theologians. But this wasn't about argument. This was something else entirely. Faith doesn't bother me, he finally said, his voice lower than before. What bothers me is how people use it. How they justify ignorance, violence, oppression. How they use God as an excuse to stop thinking for themselves. Barron studied him. Some do, he admitted. But is that a problem with faith? Or with people? Graves opened his mouth, then hesitated. Barron leaned back, his gaze unwavering. You hold faith to a standard you don't hold anything else to. Science has been used to justify eugenics. Politics has been used to justify war. Even philosophy has been used to justify some of history's worst atrocities. But you don't dismiss those things entirely. You separate the abuse from the truth. Why not faith? A murmur ran through the class. For the first time, the professor looked tired. He turned away slightly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. The discussion was still his, but he no longer controlled it. The moment felt bigger than a debate. It felt personal. Barron watched him carefully, then spoke, his voice softer now. You always ask students why they believe in God. Graves glanced at him. But have you ever asked yourself why you don't? The silence was absolute. Barron wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to humiliate. The question wasn't an attack. It was an invitation. And that, more than anything else, was what made it powerful. For the first time, Dr. Graves didn't have a response. And for the first time, he realized he needed one. The lecture hall was silent, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was charged, expectant, like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something that had never happened before. Dr. Graves had always been the one in control, the one who dismantled ideas and left them in pieces. But today, he wasn't standing over the wreckage of someone else's belief. Today, he was standing in front of a mirror. His fingers tapped against the desk. Once. Twice. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at nothing in particular. Maybe a few seconds. Maybe an eternity. He could feel the students watching him. Waiting. Waiting to see if the man who demanded answers from everyone else would be willing to give one himself. Finally, he exhaled. His voice was quieter than before. I don't know. It wasn't the kind of statement he was known for. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't wrapped in layers of intellectual superiority. It was just 3 words. Honest. Unpolished. Barron didn't react right away. He didn't smirk. Didn't gloat. Didn't press further. He simply nodded. Like that was all he had needed to hear. Dr. Graves cleared his throat, straightening. The edge in his posture returned, but something was different now. Less like a man preparing for battle, more like someone standing at the edge of something uncertain. Class dismissed. The students hesitated, like they weren't sure if the moment was really over. Then, slowly, they gathered their things, filing out in murmurs. But the usual post-lecture chatter wasn't there. No one was talking about the upcoming test. No one was talking about weekend plans. No one was talking about lunch. They were thinking. Barron gathered his bag, moving toward the door with the rest of them. But just as he reached the exit, Dr. Graves spoke again. Barron. He stopped, turned. The professor studied him for a long moment. Then finally, he said, I've had this discussion 1,000 times, and I've never once lost control of it. Barron didn't say anything. He just waited. Dr. Graves exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You didn't try to win. His voice was quieter now. That's what made the difference. Barron considered that for a moment. Then he replied, because faith isn't about winning. He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded once and walked out. Dr. Graves stood there for a while, staring at the door, long after Barron was gone. Maybe faith was just an illusion. Maybe it wasn't. But today, for the first time in his life, he wasn't so sure. Some debates aren't about proving who's right and who's wrong. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to argue. It's to make someone think. Faith, logic, doubt. They don't have to be enemies. They can coexist. And maybe, just maybe, the people who challenge us the most aren't the ones trying to tear us down. Maybe they're the ones asking us the questions we've been too afraid to ask ourselves.